Well, welcome to our Wednesday night Bible study. I'm so glad that you joined us tonight. I hope you've had a great week up to now. And here we go again, right? We are in the 5th week of a series on Elisha. Now, we started way back in the fall reading through the life of Elijah, the great Old Testament prophet. Well, when Elijah was taken to heaven, his servant or his teammate, really, Elisha, who was a mentee, took the mantle and God continued to work through him. And I think Elisha is such an interesting character. Well, in today's study, we're going to pick up where we left off last week. And so if you did not hear last week's lesson about Naaman the leper, the great general, he was a captain, he led troops into battle, he was famous and he was revered and he was very rich and all the stuff you can say about him. I mean, he was signing autographs wherever he went. Naaman became a leper. And he went to Elisha for healing. Naaman was from Syria. He was from Damascus. And so that he came to Israel is kind of a big deal. He came to Elisha for healing. And Elisha did not even go out and meet him. We'll pick up this story today, but he was healed. And why God chose to heal him, I don't know. That's up to God. But it was such a cool story last week about obedience and how to follow God even when you don't understand it. And here's a guy who really wanted to pay for his healing. And God said, no, thank you. I just want you to do it my way. It's really a cool story. Well, today we're going to share a second half of that story. Last week where we left Naaman, he had just been healed. And now we want to see what happened in the aftermath of that. So I hope you'll go back and listen to that. You can just hit pause. So on our YouTube channel, you probably just look on the side of your screen right now and find it. And then come back and join us for tonight's study. But one thing that you need for this is you need to have a Bible. I mean, as you can see, I don't have a TV screen on either side of me. There's no special effects. There's not like an overlay that's going to happen. This is about as no frills as it gets. This is just me with some notes in front of me, and I've written Bible verses on these notes. And so this is really just me reading through Scripture with you. I'm not doing a big presentation. I'm just trying to read and think with you. And so you really have to be engaged for this to work. Otherwise, it's just going to be very boring for you. So what I hope you'll do is hit pause, go get your Bible and a pen, and I want you to be able to take notes and circle words and jot some things in your margins, and then come back. We're going to be in 2 Kings chapter 5, and once you find that, let's pick up, all right? So hit pause and go get those and then come back. There is an interesting legend in Greek mythology of a beautiful woman named Atalanta. And she had a hopeful suitor named Hippomenes. All right, now Atalanta was the fastest runner in her Greek city-state. And she had decided to challenge all of her suitors to a race with one condition. She said, I will marry the man who wins a foot race against me, but everyone who loses has to be put to death. All right, and a lot of people accepted that challenge because she was very beautiful and they were guys, and that's just how it goes. But one after another, man after man lost the race in their life. And then along came a pretty crafty guy named Hippomenes who accepted the challenge. Now, Hippomenes understood that Atalanta could run faster than him, but before the foot race, he devised a plan. He hid 3 apples made of solid gold inside of his pockets. And so when the race began, Atalanta started to outdistance him fairly easily, and he took the first golden apple from inside his tunic and he tossed it in front of her. And as she was running, she saw the glitter of that golden apple. It caught her eye, and she stopped to pick it up, and as she stopped, Hippomenes ran right past her. Well, she quickly recovered and she outdistanced him again, and then another golden apple rolled off the track ahead of her, and she stopped to pick it up, and she allowed Hippomenes again to sweep past her. Well, the finish line was near and he was ahead, and once more she overtook him, and sensing that this was his last chance, he rolled the third golden apple in front of her, and while she wavered between the finish line and her greed, Hippomenes swept past her and won the race. The legend says that they were married and lived happily ever after. I'm not sure I believe any of that, certainly not that part. But what I like about the story is that he caught Atalanta off guard. She stepped off the track and lost the race because of the glitter of gold. Now, I don't know if you know this. You may be very savvy on the Old Testament, but some of the strongest warnings in the New Testament, and there's a lot of strong warnings, but one of the strongest warnings in the New Testament occur in a letter that Paul wrote to his young disciple Timothy. I'm going to start today by reading those warnings. I know you're at 2 Kings in your Bible. You don't necessarily have to turn here, but if you want to, I'm in 1 Timothy chapter 6. And here's what Paul said, listen. He said, godliness actually is a means of great gain when accompanied by contentment. And you got to understand that word contentment does not mean passive acceptance. It is like active independence. The Greek word literally means independent of circumstances. So Paul says godliness needs to be accompanied by this contentment that's independent of circumstances. Verse 7, for we have brought nothing into the world, so we can take nothing out of it either. Continue to verse 8. If we have food and covering, with these we shall be content. But those who want to get rich fall into temptation and a snare. Now stop and notice that Paul did not write, but some people who want to get rich. He didn't write, but I heard of one man who wanted to get rich and fell into temptation. No, he wrote, but those who want to get rich fall into temptation. People who want to get rich, they fall into a snare. And by the way, he also did not say those who are rich. Rather, he said those who want to get rich. See, the Greek word for want to is a word that literally means to purpose or to will. In other words, a way to translate what he said is those who set the counsel of their mind and heart on becoming rich, who take everything in you and you're just focused on becoming rich. Every single one of those people fall into a temptation and a trap. And many, this is verse 9, and many foolish and harmful desires which plunge men into ruin and destruction. And that word plunge means to drag to the bottom, to drag down. The idea is of someone who's drowning at sea in a sea of their own desires. And then comes verse 10. You've probably heard this. For the love of money is a root of all sorts of evil. And Paul did not say money is the root of evil. He said the love of money is a root of all sorts of evil. For some, by longing for it, have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. They wandered away from the race. They were running the race, and then ahead of them, just a little off the path of godly endurance, a golden apple rolled into view. And it was just a little detour. It was just one greedy decision, one dishonest compromise, and things seemed to be all right, and it seemed to not be so bad, but in reality, they didn't even know it. They had stepped right into a trap. And the trap is in forgetting that you did not bring anything into this world, and you're not going to take anything out of it. And so instead of setting your heart and mind on righteousness and godliness and faith and love and perseverance and gentleness, you've lost sight of the goal, and now you're just chasing every glittering apple that attracts your fancy. All right, now use that as a setup for what we're going to read tonight. All right, because this is very important to the story of Naaman. I want to go back and refresh your memory on this story to what we read last week. Look at verse 1. This is 2 Kings 5:1. Now Naaman was commander of the army of King Aram. He was a great man in the sight of his master and highly regarded, because through him the Lord had given victory to Aram. He was a valiant soldier, but he had leprosy. Now the text does not give chronological clues, but it is very clear that Naaman's leprosy did not surface or activate in his body until later years. All right, because we get this brief description, but what we can see is that Naaman had it made. He was at the top of the heap in the kingdom. He was respected and trusted. He was a confidant and a friend of the king because really, especially because of his victory over King Ahab, he was every soldier's idol. And I told you last week, Josephus, the historian, even argues that Naaman is the one who shot the arrow that killed King Ahab, a great story from the Old Testament. And that would have made him a legend. And so if you let your mind wander over his description, he was a great man, a respected warrior, a valiant warrior, and a leper. A leper. a valiant soldier who would no longer be sought out by his army. His soldiers would avoid him at all costs. And the whispers had already spread through the camp and through the Syrian kingdom. Naaman was a leper. Now, this is the horror of a terminal disease that repulsed everyone. And it was so horrible, in fact, that it can overshadow the horror that was brought about in the life of a little girl. See, I told you last week that there's a little girl in this story, and we kind of glossed over her part last week, but I want to focus on her because she builds into this whole thing. I just don't want you to miss this. Look at 2 Kings 5:2. Now the bands of raiders from Aram had gone out and had taken captive a young girl from Israel, and she served Naaman's wife. Now what happened is that in the course of the raids carried out by the Syrians against neighboring Hebrew villages, a young girl was taken captive. And that's all the Bible records. We don't know any circumstances. And yet, even in that sentence, there's just so much terror that's spoken of. Can you imagine your home being broken into by a raiding party of enemy soldiers? And that Hebrew verb translated raiding party is a verb that's rendered like to cut, to penetrate. One Greek translation recalls that these men were one-belted, which, that's actually what it says, which means that they were dressed and outfitted lightly for guerrilla tactics. They could get in quickly, kill, pillage, and then disappear into the night. And suddenly, without warning, perhaps hearing the screams of her mother or watching her father die in a struggle, this young girl found herself in the clutches of a barbarian. And the Hebrew text here says that she was not among the captives taken. What it says, it indicates that on this particular raid, she was the only captive taken. One author that I read said, few people suffered what she suffered. Captured by an enemy soldier, exiled to a foreign country, forever separated from her family, consigned to a lifetime of slavery. You can imagine this little girl in the Capitol Square being auctioned off. And we're not told how it happened, only that it did. And then in one final twist of agony, she finds herself a slave in the household of the great warlord himself. And I guess I'm saying all of that just to help you see how incredible it is that the words in verse 3 ever came to her lips. She said to her mistress, if only my master would see the prophet who is in Samaria, he would cure him of his leprosy. That one little phrase is all the record we have that this girl spoke, and yet it speaks volumes. I don't want to spend a lot of our time here, but because there's another part of the story, but I just want you to hear this because this convicts me. When I read her response here, it really convicts me. I'm convicted by her compassion. Why should she care whether Naaman is well or not? The Syrians were enemies of Israel. Her master was a pagan warlord. He was an idolater. Why would she want him to live? I'm pretty sure if I were her, I would lay my head on the pillow at night and thank God Almighty that miserable man was suffering with leprosy. Lord, let him die slowly. Wouldn't you be tempted to pray that? Do you have someone at work who hates you? Someone who ridicules your faith, who makes life miserable for you? How motivated you are to enjoy their good health? See, and then I think of Jesus weeping over Jerusalem, and he knew how they were going to treat him. And I remember Paul saying that while I was still a sinner, Christ died for me. See, I'm convicted by this girl's compassion. And one more thing about her compassion, Naaman's disease made him a pariah. And there were not very many people who genuinely allowed themselves to be close to him, much less to care for him. I think people have more of like a bless your heart kind of mentality, and yet this girl genuinely cares. I'm convicted by her compassion. And I am convicted by her faith because here's another thing. This little girl has rock solid faith in God. She says, I tell you what, if my master would go to the prophet in Samaria, he would be healed. What she's saying is, don't put out more sacrifices for Baal. Don't go to the prophets and priests of Baal. Go to Elisha. He can heal you, Naaman. You know why I think that's so wild? You might say, well, because she would probably just saw this all the time, right? Well, I think this is so wild for two reasons. First of all, because if there's ever been somebody who had a reason to doubt the existence of God, it's this little girl. The Israelites were losing. There was famine in the land, and Baalism was the worship of the people, and she had been ripped from her home, and so where was God? But instead of doubting God, she affirmed him. And then there's also the fact that you might think, yeah, but she probably saw Elisha heal lepers before. No, she didn't. She had never seen that. And you might say, yeah, okay, but how do you know that? How do you know? Well, let me show you how I know. If you want to, you can just turn over. This is in Luke 4. And in Luke 4, Jesus is teaching the people about faith. And Jesus references Elisha. This is Luke 4, verse 25. Jesus said, I assure you that there were many widows in Israel in Elisha's time when the sky was shut for 3.5 years and there was a severe famine throughout the land. And yet Elijah was not sent to any of them, but to a widow in Zarephath in the region of Sidon. And there were many in Israel with leprosy in the time of Elisha the prophet, yet not one of them was cleaned, only Naaman the Syrian. See what Jesus says? Elisha wasn't out there healing lepers right and left. You know how many lepers Elisha had healed at this point? None. 0. And yet this little girl is just certain he can do it. And what she's saying is, Naaman, I know that Israel is full of lepers. And as far as I can tell, Elisha's never healed a single one. And yet I am positive that if you could just talk to him, he would heal you. She hasn't seen it, but she believes. And that is faith. How do you make a difference for God? Well, you don't have to be polished or some sort of expert or even very knowledgeable. You just need compassion and faith and courage to speak. Now, let's keep going in this story because there is a twist to the story I wanted to show you. Remember that when Naaman came to see Elisha, and you can hear this in last week's lesson, he brought with him a lot of money. He came from Syria loaded down with about $1.2 million worth of gold and silver and clothing. And after he was healed, after he came up out of the water and he looked at his hands and his leprosy was gone, he returned and begged Elisha to receive a gift. All right, I'm in 2 Kings 5, verse 15. Then Naaman and all of his attendants went back to the man of God. He stood before them and he said, Now I know that there is no God in all the world except in Israel. So please accept a gift from your servant. And the prophet answered, As surely as the Lord lives, whom I serve, I will not accept a thing. And even though Naaman urged him, he refused. Now, why do you think Elisha refused the gift? Okay, I can't say for sure. I'll tell you what I think. I think he refused the gift because he wanted Naaman to know, you can't buy this. Your money cannot buy this. This is grace. That's what I think. And in verse 7, Naaman said, Well, if you will not, then please let me, your servant, be given as much earth as a pair of mules can carry. For your servant will never again make burnt offerings and sacrifices to any other god but the Lord. But may the Lord forgive your servant for this one thing. When my master enters this temple of Rimmon to bow down and he is leaning on my arm, I have to bow there also. When I bow down in the temple of Rimmon, may the Lord forgive your servant for this. Go in peace, Elisha said. So what happened here is that eventually Naaman and his splendid entourage left, and they had all this great joy over Naaman's healing, and everything they had brought with them, they were taking home. Now, in these days, people had the idea that the gods of a nation resided in that nation. And so if you left the land, you left the God behind too. And Naaman had just testified that Jehovah was God in all the earth. And so taking the soil, this was a courageous act because his master and his friends were surely going to ask Naaman what that soil meant. And he would have to tell them about his faith in the God of Israel. Now, in a second request, I think Naaman showed unusual insight. Because what he realized is that the king would expect him to continue his official acts as the commander of the army. And that included accompanying the king into the temple of Rimmon. That's the Syrian equivalent of Baal. And Naaman was willing to perform that ritual outwardly. He figured he just had to, but he wanted Elisha to know that his heart wasn't going to be in it. That this healing had changed his life, and he anticipated that it would impact the royal court, and by the way, that maybe eventually it would lead to the king's conversion. Now, what's happening is that as this conversation is taking place between Naaman and Elisha, as that's happening, there is someone else here. All right, as Elisha is quietly refusing the gift, there's another man standing there. And this man was silently, and from what we'll discover later, he was silently standing there. And what we'll discover later is that he was evidently seething on the inside due to maybe anger, frustration, greed. This guy's name is Gehazi. He is Elisha's servant. Look at verse 19. After Naaman had traveled some distance, Gehazi, the servant of Elisha, the man of God, said to himself, "My master was too easy on Naaman, this Aramean, by not accepting from him what he brought. As surely as the Lord lives, I will run after him and get something from him." All right, now this is the moment when a golden apple rolled across Gehazi's path, and he became distracted. And now he's going to reach down to take it. Now, before going any further, you need to understand something about Gehazi that I think will help. See, we're first introduced to Gehazi as Elisha's servant in chapter 4. And as his servant or attendant, he traveled with the great prophet. He would serve the prophet by perhaps fixing his meals or keeping things tidy. And it would be his role to represent the prophet to people who came. And it was much more than a lowly servant's role. It was really an honored position. In fact, it used to be Elisha's position. He was Elijah's servant. Okay, so it's not a bad position. The son of a prophet who had passion for the glory of God to be revealed in Israel. That's who Gehazi is. And he was probably selected from the top of his class because of his ability and his potential and his heart. And maybe he's been earmarked to be Elisha's replacement someday. I mean, he's more than just some servant. He was perhaps the next prophet of God who was in training under the tutelage of his master Elisha. So why would a guy like Gehazi take the bait here? Well, look again what he said. "My master was too easy on Naaman, this Aramean, by not accepting from him what he brought." The construction of the words, this Naaman. He was too easy on this Naaman. I mean, that's contempt. There's contempt in those words. In other words, what he's saying is, he has spared of all men, this man, this enemy of Israel, this Syrian warlord, this pagan. Of all people, he's healed him, and he hasn't even received what he brought. And he is allowing 1.2 million Syrian dollars to slip through his fingers. See, I can't help but believe by what happens next that Gehazi thinks that the Lord will not be too upset by his decision to deceive. Because if you continue to the last part of verse 20, he said, "As the Lord lives, I will run after him and take something from him." See, he's twisted this thing in his mind, this deceit and greed. He's twisted it around until it fits his ministerial mindset. As the Lord lives, I'll do this. In other words, this can't be all bad. And think of what we could give if we had it. I mean, you get how you can rationalize stuff. And then he said, "As the Lord lives, I will run." I mean, you should underline that word. I will run after him. 150 years ago, in this commentary on this passage, an author wrote, "Greed is the passion that makes all men like Gehazi run." People are everywhere out of breath in their race for more. Verse 21. So Gehazi pursued Naaman. And this is implied trouble. He's off the track now. He's running as fast as he can for this apple. And when Naaman saw one running after him, he came down from the chariot to meet him and said, "Is all well?" And he said, "All is well." So that's lie number one. All is not well. And then Gehazi said, "My master has sent me." That's lie number two. My master has sent me. 2 young men from the company of the prophets have just come to me from the hill country of Ephraim. Please give them a talent of silver and 2 sets of clothing." Now, do you notice the carefully crafted web of lies that he's spinning here? It's not just, "I want some money." He's come up with prophets coming to Elisha's house, how old they are, what part of the country they've come from, what their hometown is. He's thought this through as he's racing after Naaman, and he has all of his lies mapped out. It sounds so good. I mean, it has to be true. And Naaman is overwhelmed by joy at this. I mean, he's overwhelmed by joy anyway, and he loves it. He says, "Be pleased to take 2 talents, not just 1 talent of silver, take 2. I mean, this is getting better all the time, Gehazi thinks, and he probably is pleased to take 2 talents instead of 1. 2 talents of silver is worth about $1,000. So how much is your integrity worth, Gehazi? What's the price tag on your character? About $1,000. Naaman urged Gehazi to accept them. And then he tied up the 2 talents of silver in 2 bags with 2 sets of clothing. He gave them to 2 of his servants, and they carried them ahead of Gehazi. When Gehazi came to the hill, he took the things from the servants and put them away in his house. He sent the men away, and they left. And when he went in and stood before his master, Elisha asked him, "Where have you been, Gehazi?" Now, don't you know that question put Gehazi's heart in his throat? I kind of imagine the palms becoming sweaty. I imagine his mind starting to race. Does Elisha know? I mean, could he have seen me? Was he looking around the corner when I hid the silver and clothing? Did he see me coming over the hill? Did someone tell him? I mean, I didn't think he would know I was even away. And then maybe with a nervous laugh, Gehazi said, "Where have I been? I haven't been anywhere." And there's another lie. Verse 26, "But Elisha said to him, 'Was not my spirit with you when the man got down from his chariot to meet you? Is this the time to take money or accept clothes or olive groves and vineyards or flocks and herds or male and female slaves?'" See, here's the thing. Gehazi longed to be a wealthy man with land and flocks and herds and expensive clothing and servants to obey his orders. He was not content to labor by the side of Elisha the prophet. He wanted to have security and comfort. And there's nothing wrong with being wealthy. It is okay. If that's God's will for your life, so be it. For Abraham and Isaac, they were wealthy. So was David. He was so wealthy. But is it wrong to get that wealth through deceit? You know it is. It's wrong to make that wealth your God. You know it is. And what Gehazi had done is he had used the ministry that God gave him as a means of deceiving Naaman. And as you know, that's contrary to God's will. Verse 27 is a harsh one. Elisha said, "Naaman's leprosy will cling to you and to your descendants forever." And then Gehazi went from Elisha's presence, and his skin was leprosy. It was leprous. It had become white as snow. Wow. And that's where the story ends. And actually, there's more chapters with Gehazi, and we'll maybe touch on him again later because his story isn't quite over. It's a pretty wild story, isn't it? I mean, here's a guy in Naaman who was physically sick, but God was doing something great inside of him. And yet here's a guy, Naaman, who seemed to be spiritually well, who seemed to be spiritually well and physically well, but spiritually he was sick. There was something off in him. His heart was coveting. And so what we see at the end is we see Naaman healed, and we see Gehazi sick. There's a lot of things you could take from this story, and I wish you were in a class with me right now because I'd like to ask you to connect some dots in this and maybe make some applications. One thing you might carry out of this is that just because you're friends with a spiritual giant doesn't make you a spiritual giant. Just because you go to church with some Christians doesn't make you a Christian. All right, faith has to be personal. You've got to keep yourself connected with God. You might take away as an application that even God's people are not immune from greed. We're all people, and we've got to guard our hearts, and not one time and for all, every day. One thing you might cling to in this story is that sin will not remain secret. And if you have some sin in your life, some besetting sin, and you think that it's going to forever stay hidden in the shadows, I got bad news for you. It's not. But that's also good news, because you can't fix what you won't confront. And the only way for you to get well is to get that stuff out in the light. You might take as an application of this story that you need to run with your eyes fixed on Jesus, and pray that God will help you not to become distracted by all of the glittering distractions that are around us, because they look valuable, but they're worthless. They make us sick. Only when you're running toward Jesus are you truly well. Look, this has been a cool story. It's 2 weeks now we've talked about Naaman and his healing, and I hope that this has been beneficial for you. I hope you've enjoyed it. I really like doing the study. We've actually got one more week to talk about Elisha. We're going to do that one more time next week. And in 2 weeks from today, on February 10th, we're going to use this time as a 40-day home group. All right, now, home, of course, we can't get in people's homes this year because of the pandemic. And so we have some different options that you'll be hearing about how groups will be ordered, and some will be online and some will be in person. Well, what's going to happen here is that on Wednesday nights at 7 o'clock, we're going to have a home group live in this room. And so if you'd like to come, I'm going to teach it, and we're going to be talking about our 40-day book. We're going to be talking about Roar. You have to wear a mask, and we're going to be distanced in the room, just like on Sunday mornings. But it's going to be a chance for you. Your kids can come here and get their group down the hall, and you can come here, and we can do this live in the room. And for those of you who don't want to be live in the room, we will also live stream this on Wednesday nights. So on Wednesdays at 7, you'll be able to join that way. That's one of our groups, and I'd love to invite you to that. Now, that starts in 2 weeks. Our first was on February 10th. In the meantime, we've got one more week with Elisha. We'll do that next week. God bless you. I love you guys. I appreciate you. You know what? There's brighter days coming, but God has been so good to us, and I'm so happy that you're part of our church, that you've chosen to join us on Wednesday nights. If you've enjoyed the study, share it with somebody. Pass it along. Send them an email with the link, or maybe share it on your social media, and I'd love to hear from you if you have any questions or comments. God bless you. See you next week.